Welcome to this captivating journey through the life and legacy of Anne Boleyn, one of the most iconic and enigmatic figures in English history. Born around 1501 into a family of ambition and nobility, Anne's sharp intellect and refined manners took her from the countryside of Kent to the glittering courts of Europe. She mesmerized King Henry VIII with her wit, allure, and unyielding spirit, sparking a royal romance that shook the foundations of church and state. From her formative years in France to her fateful rise as Queen of England, Anne's story offers a kaleidoscope of intrigue, ambition, passion, and tragedy. Throughout her short reign, she inspired intense devotion and venomous criticism alike, leaving an indelible mark on England's political and religious landscape. Even after her downfall, Anne's greatest legacy lived on in her daughter, Elizabeth I, who would one day become one of England's most celebrated monarchs. Join us as we delve into the life of this remarkable woman and uncover the story behind one of history's most dramatic chapters. It was said she entered the world around the year 1501 in the spacious chambers of Blickling Hall in Norfolk, a grand estate ringed by rolling green fields and swaying woodland. Her name was Anne Boleyn, though at the time no one could have foretold the seismic waves her life would cause across England and in time all of Europe. In her earliest days, she was only a tiny bundle in elegant swaddling, the daughter of Sir Thomas Boleyn and his wife Elizabeth Howard. They were a family whose blood ran thick with ambition. Thomas Boleyn was sharp of mind, polished in manners, and skilled enough in languages, French especially, to impress kings. Elizabeth Howard, daughter of the future second Duke of Norfolk, brought her own illustrious lineage to the marriage. Together they formed the foundation of Anne's earliest world, though not even they could guess the path she would blaze. Sir Thomas was a courtier of significance, a man with big aspirations, who found ways to climb rung after rung in King Henry VII's favor. He was an adroit diplomat, able to charm his way through the intricate corridors of power. And then there was Elizabeth Howard, a lady who had once served as lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon in the first years of Henry VIII's reign. Their union gave Anne a sense of lofty expectations from infancy. If you looked at the baby dozing in a carved cradle, you might only see a child with a winsome but unremarkable face. Yet from the start, her father's drive and her mother's noble blood set her on a path that would one day entwine with the monarchy itself. Before she could form any real memories of Blickling Hall, the family shifted their principal seat to Hever Castle in Kent. The move placed them within easier reach of the court's political orbit. Far away from the comfortable hush of Norfolk, Hever Castle offered a different brand of majesty, a moated fortress, smaller but full of history, quietly tucked into the lush English countryside. Within its walls, Anne and her siblings, her sister Mary, her brother George, were brought up in a manner befitting children of a rising influential family. No one is absolutely sure which of the Boleyn children was the eldest, because the birth order debates have raged among historians for centuries. Some say Mary came first, with Anne in the middle and George last. Others differ. But we know that Anne became the singular figure who, through her combination of spirit, education, and cunning, would reshape the monarchy. From an early age, she showed a bright curiosity. Anne's father, appreciative of intelligence, made sure his children received an education that went beyond the standard needlework and housekeeping tasks expected of daughters of nobility. Anne and George thrived in these studies. They learned to read and write, to speak French fluently, to appreciate music. Anne could pick up a lute and strum soft melodies. She could shape her words in conversational French with such ease that Margaret of Austria herself, regent of the Netherlands, found reason to comment upon the girl's promise. But the physical side of Anne's inheritance came with rumors and whispers. She had a darker complexion, dark hair, and eyes that seemed almost black, unusual in an age that often praised fair curls and pale eyes as the highest standard of beauty. More scandalous was the talk that she might have been born with a small extra finger on one hand and a peculiar mark or mole upon her neck. Whispers cast them as the devil's stamp. Yet it's equally possible that any unusual features were exaggerated, shaped by her enemies to paint her as a dangerous temptress. Whatever the truth, Anne learned to dress cleverly, wearing sleeves and gowns that minimize these rumored imperfections. Her future portraits would never show anything untoward. Indeed, she would come to be seen by many as more compelling than conventionally pretty, a woman whose allure came not from standard beauty, but from her wit, charm, and something almost intangible in her presence. As adolescence approached, Anne's father, Thomas Boleyn, recognized that she was uniquely suited to move in higher circles. She had, in addition to her quick mind, an appealing sophistication. That's why, around 1513, he arranged for her to join the household of Margaret of Austria in Brussels. This was a coveted spot, highly sought by families who wanted their daughters to receive polished educations and form continental connections. Anne excelled in that environment. Margaret wrote to Thomas Boleyn with warm praise, describing Anne's courtesy, intelligence, and readiness to learn. In 1514, Anne left Brussels behind when her father redirected her to a brand new opportunity. Mary Tudor, the King of France's new bride, sister of Henry VIII, needed English attendance at the French court. Anne's sister, Mary Boleyn, was also making her way there. Together they served in the flamboyant, glittering world of the French monarchy. But the French court had its own drama. Though Mary Tudor was briefly Queen of France, her husband Louis XII died just 3 months after the wedding. This upheaval scattered her household. Many attendants returned to England in May 1515. Not Anne and Mary. They chose to stay, the one in attendance on the new Queen Claude, the other floating among the more frivolous circles. Anne's years in France would deeply shape her. In Queen Claude's more pious and quieter household, she had a chance to refine her talents: needlework, music, dance, conversation. She also encountered progressive ideas, possibly from Marguerite d'Angoulême, King Francis VIII's sister, who was known for dabbling in humanist and reformist thought. And then there was Mary Boleyn, who found herself with quite a reputation for generosity with her affections. She gained infamy as a royal mistress, first of Francis I, and then, rumor had it, of various courtiers. This carried consequences. Once the Boleyn family learned of the gossip swirling around Mary, she was swiftly called back to England. Anne, on the other hand, continued to remain in France, forging a more respectable path. By 1522, after nearly 9 years away, Anne was summoned home. She slipped back onto English soil with a grace that would set tongues wagging. Not long after her arrival, she joined the household of Catherine of Aragon, the queen consort of Henry VIII, as a lady-in-waiting. A returning courtier from the French scene was always cause for curiosity. Anne, with her French fashions, sophisticated speech, and that intangible spark, became the center of new intrigue. She was no classic blonde Tudor rose, but a dark-eyed figure whose stylishness suggested she might be capable of stirring up something unprecedented. It was around 1525 when the king first took serious note of Anne Boleyn. Really took note, that is, beyond polite acknowledgments. Catherine of Aragon was older now, hovering around her 40s, and had lost the bloom of youth after many difficult pregnancies that yielded only one surviving daughter, Princess Mary. Henry VIII, driven by his desire for a male heir and perhaps a renewed sense of romance, found himself inexorably drawn to this woman with midnight hair and eyes to match. But ironically, at that time, Anne's older sister, Mary Boleyn, had already been Henry's mistress. That relationship ended quietly before Henry turned his attentions to Anne. There is a notion that Henry's initial pursuit of Anne was purely physical, the whim of a restless king. After all, he'd sought out mistresses before, and few had refused him. Yet Anne was different. At first she resisted. She refused to become just another mistress. Henry wrote her ardent letters, some survive even now, declaring the depth of his feelings, a king's heartbreak laid bare in scrawled words. He begged her to come to him, to yield to his passion. She stood her ground, weaving a delicate dance of flirtation mixed with insistence on marriage. If her father had taught her anything, it was to value the long game over immediate gratification, to consider the advantage that might come from making a powerful man yearn. And so she slipped away from court, presumably hoping to escape the king's relentless pursuit. The result was an even more heated chase, with Henry sending letter after letter, each more yearning and obsessive than the last. Finally, Anne granted him a measure of hope. She would be his, but only if he made her his queen. He must put aside Catherine and marry her, offering the kind of legitimacy that no mistress could ever claim. By this time, around 1527, Henry was not merely in lust with Anne Boleyn. He was in love, or so it seemed to him, wholeheartedly. She was witty, a breath of fresh air, someone who could match his intelligence in conversation, who carried the glamour of the French court in her manner, who was unlike any other woman he'd known. Henry decided that he must divorce Queen Catherine. And from that decision sprang a chain of events that would tear England from its Catholic roots and reorder society as everyone then knew it. Henry demanded an annulment, or a declaration that his marriage to Catherine was null from the start. The reason he gave was drawn from Scripture. Catherine had been married to his brother Arthur, making Henry's subsequent marriage to her, in theory, a sin. If a man shall take his brother's wife, reads Leviticus, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless. That was enough for Henry to rationalize all the heartbreak and miscarriages, all the lost hopes for a living son. Of course, he also had an out-of-wedlock son, Henry Fitzroy, which rather contradicted a literal childless fate. But Henry found ways to interpret the text to his liking. In short, he concluded he had never been truly married. He turned to the Pope, Clement VII, expecting a relatively quick resolution. Fate, however, had other ideas. The Pope at that time was effectively imprisoned by Emperor Charles V, who was none other than Queen Catherine's nephew. This spelled doom for the king's hopes of a prompt annulment. Back in England, Henry's great counselor, Cardinal Wolsey, tried to arrange a special court that would handle the problem. Wolsey was a brilliant statesman, but the matter proved too big, too tangled. The special court ended up tossing the question back to Rome. With Catherine resolutely refusing to back down, she insisted her marriage to Henry was valid. Rome's deliberations dragged on. Wolsey fell from favor, arrested and disgraced, dying on his way to a trial that could well have ended in his execution. Henry's obsession with Anne fueled him to extreme measures. If the Pope refused to free him to marry the woman he loved, perhaps he could break from the Pope's authority altogether. Step by step, he moved in that direction, with help from key figures like Thomas Cromwell, Thomas Cranmer, and the quieter but persistent influence of Anne Boleyn herself. She was rumored to have sympathies with the Lutheran Reformation. At the very least, she was open to new ideas and sought out religious texts in English, a gesture that signaled subtle rebellion against the Catholic tradition that insisted on Latin. By 1532, Henry had styled himself the supreme head of the Church in England. Parliament sealed the break with laws that severed ties to Rome. He forced the clergy to acknowledge his primacy, and soon the Church of England was born in all but name. In 1533, Thomas Cranmer, newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, solemnly pronounced Henry's marriage to Catherine invalid. By then, Henry had secretly wed Anne Boleyn. Some say it happened in a private ceremony in late 1532, but the more official date was January 25th, 1533. Not surprisingly, Anne was pregnant. The timeline suggests that Henry, racing against the cradle, wanted to make sure this child would be legitimate. Once the king's new marriage was recognized by the archbishop, Anne was publicly declared Queen of England. But if she hoped that the people would welcome her with open arms, she was sorely mistaken. Catherine had been beloved by many, and countless subjects saw Anne as an upstart, a homewrecker, possibly a heretic. Ugly rumors traveled through taverns and town squares, whispered by peasants and courtiers alike. Some believed she had bewitched the king, some spat on the ground when they spoke her name. Yet for a brief moment Anne's future looked dazzling. She was crowned in an extravagant ceremony in June 1533 that Henry planned with no expense spared, determined to present her as every inch the rightful queen. She processed through the streets in a grand pageant, with torches blazing and trumpets sounding. The monarchy put forth a tremendous effort to legitimize and celebrate this new order. On September 7th, 1533, Anne gave birth. Henry's heart must have pounded with hope for a son, the mythical heir that had driven him to tear apart his kingdom's religion and discard a faithful wife of 2 decades. Instead, the baby was a girl, a small, healthy daughter that they christened Elizabeth. Disappointment lingered in the hush that fell over the court. This was not what Henry had torn heaven and earth apart to achieve. Still, he consoled himself that Anne was young. She could conceive again, perhaps soon. This princess, Elizabeth, might one day be overshadowed by a brother. In time, ironically, she would overshadow everyone, emerging as Elizabeth I, one of England's greatest rulers. But in that moment, the child's gender stung. The marriage began under a blaze of passion that once seemed unstoppable, but it fractured with disquieting speed. In the early days, while Henry was still aflame with his pursuit of Anne Boleyn, he appeared to remain loyal, showering her with tokens of devotion and writing her fervent letters. Court whispers insisted that, throughout those heady years of secret courtship, he did not stray elsewhere. Yet as soon as Anne became queen, perhaps once the thrill of chasing her ended, or once the burden of producing an heir became too crushing, his restlessness returned. Henry VIII was, at heart, a man unaccustomed to curbing his desires. His long-established pattern of seeking out mistresses resurfaced, and he went about it with the entitlement of a king who had already upended his realm's religious and political order to win the woman he wanted. Anne was not blind to this, nor was she the type to endure humiliation silently. She confronted him, sometimes pleading, sometimes raging. Each confrontation met with an unspoken reminder of Henry's authority. He was the King of England, and to defy him was a perilous choice for anyone, even the Queen. On occasion, he told her outright that she ought to feel grateful. Had he not lifted her from obscurity and made her queen? Had he not risked the fury of the Catholic powers and severed ties with Rome just to marry her? Though it had once thrilled him that Anne would challenge him with her intellect and refusal to bow meekly. Now that same spirit grated on him. The tension ate away at the remains of their once fiery bond, fueling the gossip that circulated among courtiers, who took note of every sharp word, every gesture of displeasure between them. Anne's desperation intensified with each passing month. She understood perfectly that the surest way to maintain her hard-won position was to deliver a living son. In 1533, she had given birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, a blow not only to Henry, but to her own prospects. His patience had limits, and so did her grace in the eyes of the court. In 1534, she conceived again. Eager hope must have mingled with anxiety as she progressed through the pregnancy. She likely surrounded herself with the best physicians, mindful that her very queenship might rest on the successful arrival of a healthy boy. Yet fate showed no mercy. She suffered a miscarriage. Historians do not agree on every detail, but the fact of her loss is undisputed. Its effect on her relationship with Henry must have been as dire as it was immediate. Though he initially seemed to accept her assurances that she could conceive again, something within him shifted. The kingdom's rumor mill buzzed with suggestions that his eye was already roving elsewhere, that his disappointment had eroded his ability to feign tenderness. Time passed, and Anne, seemingly resilient, became pregnant once more, this time in late 1535 or very early 1536. The king's court had by then grown weary of the ongoing tension. Queen Catherine of Aragon remained alive, though exiled, and her supporters quietly grumbled that Anne's position was illegitimate. Princess Mary, Catherine's daughter, was also a constant thorn in Anne's side, refusing to acknowledge her stepmother's authority and denying that she herself was no longer the legitimate heir. The entire realm simmered with uncertainty. Then in January of 1536, news broke that Catherine of Aragon had died of what was widely believed to be natural causes. Henry, on receiving the news, reportedly celebrated with new vigor. Anne may have joined him in private delight, or at least relief, believing that Catherine's death at last removed the specter of any legal or moral challenges to her own marriage. Now she could be the uncontested queen once and for all. Yet ironically, almost at the very moment she might have felt most secure, tragedy struck again. She miscarried her child. This time, many sources claim she lost a male fetus, a bitter heartbreak that left her in grief and panic. The timing was cruel. She needed that son more than ever, both to solidify her status in the king's eyes and to silence those who insisted that God was punishing her union with Henry. In the aftermath, some accounts say that Anne discovered Henry with Jane Seymour, a gentle and seemingly submissive attendant in her own household. The sight may have fueled a confrontation in which Anne confronted Henry with her agony, and he in turn lashed out with words that served as a harbinger of doom. He would have no more sons by her. The subtext could not be clearer. He had risked an entire empire's condemnation to gain Anne, and now she was proving herself incapable, in his view, of fulfilling her most vital function. She knew precisely how dangerous that disappointment was. The entire experiment of discarding Catherine of Aragon and aligning with Anne had been driven by the quest for a male heir. If Henry no longer believed Anne could produce one, her future looked grim indeed. By that point, Henry's circle had begun to revolve around a new center. He had taken a keen interest in Jane Seymour's docile manner, her fair looks, and her promise of unchallenging companionship, so unlike the fiery Anne. Thomas Cromwell, one of Henry's most influential ministers, watched these developments carefully. Cromwell had once been aligned with Anne, both of them supporting certain reforms in the church, but personal and policy disputes had frayed their relationship. Now, sensing Henry's disillusionment, Cromwell saw an opening. If the king wanted a way out of this marriage, if he wanted to free himself to wed Jane and continue his pursuit of a son, then Cromwell would find a way. In April 1536, a secret commission formed to investigate the Queen. The aim was clear: gather anything that might condemn Anne and remove her from Henry's path. The accusations soon ballooned into monstrous proportions. Anne Boleyn was said to have committed adultery with multiple men: Mark Smeaton, a court musician of relatively low birth; Sir Henry Norris, a friend close enough to Henry that his betrayal would sting doubly; Francis Weston, William Brereton, and, most shockingly, Anne's own brother, George Boleyn. The charge of incest was enough to make even hardened courtiers flinch. Whispers of witchcraft, an old rumor given new life by the more sensational gossip mongers, were also resurrected, painting Anne as a seductress who had bewitched Henry into casting aside his first wife. It is difficult to know what Henry himself believed. The official version is that he felt profoundly betrayed by a woman who had promised to help him secure God's favor and the royal succession, only to degrade his honor with unspeakable crimes. Yet many observers, even in the 16th century, suspected that the king's outrage was too convenient to be fully genuine, that these accusations were shaped by political necessity. Regardless, once the wheels were in motion, little could halt them. One by one, the men alleged to be Anne's lovers were interrogated. Mark Smeaton was subjected to harsh questioning, and by most accounts torture that elicited a confession. Sir Henry Norris and the others steadfastly denied the charges, but it made no difference. As for George Boleyn, the idea of incest left the court reeling. Even those who disliked the Boleyns recognized it as an accusation designed to provoke disgust and ensure that no one would speak up in Anne's defense. In the pressured atmosphere of Tudor treason trials, few would risk their own safety by insisting on the Queen's innocence. On May 2nd, Anne was arrested and brought to the Tower of London. She had been there before, but under vastly different circumstances. In 1533, on the eve of her coronation, she had arrived by river in a grand procession, greeted by salutes and cheering crowds. Now she came in a barge guarded by the king's men, her future in ruins. Shock and grief must have warred within her. Even if she had sensed Henry's waning affection or suspected that Jane Seymour was rising in his esteem, she might still have believed that Henry would not go so far as to have her arrested. After all, this was the man who had once written her letters declaring himself her loyal servant and wearing her initial on his clothing. Yet here she was, locked away in the tower's confines. The men accused alongside her were tried first. The procedures were swift and ominous, a blur of formalities in which the outcome seemed preordained. Juries filled with men who could scarcely defy the king's wishes found them all guilty. Smeaton, having confessed, though under extreme duress, was condemned to the full horror of a traitor's death. He would be hanged, drawn, and quartered. The others, being gentlemen, were sentenced to a more honorable beheading. Public sentiment was mixed. Some, steeped in fear and a sense of the king's absolute power, shrugged that justice had been done. Others whispered that it was all a brutal sham, a method of clearing the path for the king's next marriage. In the Tower, Anne likely learned of their convictions and sank further into despair, certain that the same verdict awaited her. On May 15th, she faced her own trial. A grand jury of peers, led by her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, oversaw the proceedings in the Tower's Great Hall. Anne's composure, honed by her years at the French court and by her natural ability to hold her own, did not fail her. She rose to her defense with an eloquence that even her enemies grudgingly admired. She argued that the charges of adultery were ludicrous, that incest was an abomination she would never countenance, and that the idea of conspiring against the king was inconceivable. Yet, for all her skill, she knew that no one in that chamber was likely to contradict the king's unspoken determination. Her pleas were met with stony faces. The verdict came quickly, guilty on all counts. The sentence pronounced by Norfolk was savage. She was to be burned or beheaded at the king's discretion. Historians debate how the lords in the jury truly felt. Some may have pitied her, while others despised the Boleyn ascendancy that had overshadowed them at court for years. Regardless, they had little choice but to condemn her. Displeasing Henry VIII was a risk few would dare take. 2 days later, the final blow to Anne's dignity was delivered when Archbishop Thomas Cranmer declared her marriage to Henry null and void, based on a previous contract Anne had supposedly made with Henry Percy. This meant that, in the eyes of the Church of England, Anne had never lawfully been the queen. Whether this was done to assuage Henry's conscience or to make Elizabeth's legitimacy more precarious remains a matter of historical debate. That same day, May 17th, George Boleyn and the other men convicted were put to death on Tower Hill. The commoners among them, such as Smeaton, suffered the full brutality of a traitor's demise, while the gentlemen were at least spared the more gruesome elements of the punishment. If Anne heard the drums and the crowds from within her prison rooms, she would have known that her brother and alleged lovers had met their end. Whatever her sins or ambitions, it must have been a moment of unimaginable grief and terror. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne rose early. Under the watchful eyes of her guards, she dressed in garments of black or dark gray. Some witnesses later remarked on her cloak and the French-style headdress she wore, possibly the same style she had favored in happier times. Henry had arranged for a swordsman from Calais, an unusual step that many saw as a macabre gesture of mercy or an acknowledgement of Anne's French-influenced upbringing. A sword blow was reputed to be cleaner and quicker than the swing of an English kite. The scaffold had been erected upon Tower Green, inside the walls, to keep the spectacle more contained. Still, a number of witnesses, from courtiers to commoners with certain privileges, gathered to watch. They saw her climb the steps with a steady gait, flanked by her ladies. She addressed the crowd briefly, refusing to curse the king or proclaim herself a martyr. Instead, she asked them to pray for her and for the king, acknowledging that he had always treated her well. Whether those words were heartfelt or a final performance of acceptance remains uncertain. Then she knelt upright, adopting the posture used in French executions, and waited. In a moment, with a single swift stroke of the sword, her head was severed. Thus ended the life of Anne Boleyn, the first crowned Queen of England to be executed in her own realm. Her body and head were placed in an arrow chest as no proper coffin had been prepared, and interred in the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula within the Tower precincts. The king, meanwhile, wasted little time signaling the realm that life moved on. By the next day, it was reported he was betrothed to Jane Seymour. Within a matter of months, Jane would be pregnant, carrying the son who at last gratified Henry's long-held longing, though she herself would not survive long after giving birth. For England, the events of May 1536 illustrated just how relentless Henry VIII could be once he determined to remove an obstacle, how swiftly the pendulum of favor could swing from adoration to destruction. For those in the corridors of power, it was a cautionary tale. Even a queen who had inspired the king to cast off papal authority could be cast aside if she displeased him. Anne's downfall also starkly revealed how thoroughly Henry's singular obsession with securing a male heir had reshaped the very foundations of England. When Henry first pursued her, he had defied the Pope, enraged Emperor Charles V, alienated many of his own subjects, and ushered in a religious upheaval that saw the birth of the Church of England. The ardor that had once burned so brightly for Anne, justifying Henry's break from centuries of Catholic tradition, had curdled into indifference or hatred. In the end, that same unstoppable force that had made Anne queen now destroyed her. In a matter of 3 years, she went from the most celebrated woman in England to a condemned traitor whose name was struck from official prayers. Her short reign was enough to secure the birth of Elizabeth, the infant many in court dismissed as a disappointment. Fate, however, had ironic plans. That daughter would one day ascend the throne as Elizabeth I, a queen who reigned for nearly 45 years and presided over a golden age. Elizabeth would forever be Anne Boleyn's most significant legacy, a living testament to the complex forces that had shaped the Tudor dynasty. But in the immediate wake of Anne's execution, Henry's court was awash in a mix of triumph, fear, and opportunism. Some families that had resented the Boleyn influence at court rejoiced. Others trembled to see the king's capacity for swift and ruthless action. The cardinal, who had once dominated Henry's inner circle, was gone. Rome had been publicly and dramatically rebuked. And Anne Boleyn, once so pivotal to England's transformation, was no more. Henry waited barely a day to announce his betrothal to Jane Seymour. Within months, Jane was pregnant. The entire gruesome process spelled out the king's relentless capacity to remove obstacles. Anne Boleyn, once adored with a fervor that defied the Catholic Church, had been undone by that same fervor turned to disillusionment. The courts, the cardinal, the pope, the entire tapestry of Europe's medieval order had been twisted out of shape by Henry's singular obsession with a male heir. And in that iron-fisted pursuit, he had changed England forever, severing centuries of Catholic tradition, establishing a new state church. But endings do not always extinguish legacies. Anne's life would resound through the future in multiple ways. For all the hatred that her name sometimes drew from the common people of her time, for all the propaganda that portrayed her as a witch, harlot, or cunning adulteress, she left behind one towering gift, Elizabeth. That child, dismissed by many as a disappointment for not being born a boy, would ascend the throne as Elizabeth I in 1558 and preside over a golden age in English history. In Elizabeth's brand of monarchy, astute, politically savvy, shaped by a careful balancing of religion and statecraft, we catch glimpses of the mother who was so adept at reading people, persuading them, outmaneuvering them. So it was that the daughter of Anne Boleyn stood among the ranks of the greatest monarchs, forging the Elizabethan era of exploration, cultural renaissance, and relative religious stability. In the religious sphere, Anne's influence was also woven into the transformation that took place under Henry's reign. She had introduced the king to works of reformist thinkers, encouraging an openness to unorthodox religious ideas. It was never as simple as calling Anne a Lutheran. She read scripture in English and French, and she championed the translation of the Bible for the layperson's understanding. Through her favor, certain bishops and clergymen sympathetic to reform found their way into positions of influence. After her downfall, many of these men carried forward the impetus for reformed doctrines, albeit carefully, as Henry's own religious stance zigzagged unpredictably between Catholic tradition and reformist touches. Even outside the immediate sphere of religion, Anne's story haunted the consciousness of future generations. She had proven that queens were not immune to a quick and brutal fall if they failed to align with the king's expectations. Any illusions about the monarchy's gentler side were shattered when the man who once wrote her love letters so intense they bordered on obsession saw fit to sign her death warrant. People marveled that she had soared so high, only to crash with such devastating finality. It stood as a cautionary tale for the ambitious. The higher one climbed at Henry's side, the more lethal the plunge might be when he grew weary or resentful. Yet it also illuminated the power a single individual could wield, however briefly, if they possessed enough nerve, intelligence, and magnetism to capture a king's attention. In that sense, Anne's story became a moral, political, and cultural parable that resonated long after she was gone. The swirl of rumor and legend around her never wholly abated even centuries later. Generations debated whether she was an innocent martyr, undone by unscrupulous men, or a cunning manipulator who reaped what she sowed. Some pointed to her early rejections of Henry's advances as proof of her calculated nature, dangling just enough hope to secure a crown. Others championed her refusal to capitulate. She had the backbone to stand firm, to demand respect and legitimacy. And if in that stance she inadvertently sealed her doom, well, it spoke more to the king's brutality and the precarious nature of power than to her moral guilt.